Hello, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to further explore how a board of bureaucrats impacted the lives of hundreds of their employees, influencing a government mandate that required many to accept a medical treatment or lose their jobs. In my previous video, which I've put a link to in the description below, we learned how the Border Executive Board was actually just the former Border Services Governance Group with a new name. We also looked at the elements that are expected of a governance group, especially in the public sector, if democracy is to be seen to be done. So just to remind ourselves that some of the key elements required in the public sector when there's governance or service is critical thinking, independent thought, political neutrality, free and frank advice, appointments on merit, the ability to keep management and governance separate, identify and manage risks, be transparent, and have good information. But first, here's some breaking news. On November the 4th, 2021, ACT released a media statement detailing a government response to written parliamentary questions. In essence, ACT had asked how many meetings, if any, of Cabinet had the Director-General of Health attended in 2021. The answer was 17, and the reason was to brief Cabinet about alert-level decisions. David Seymour, the ACT party leader, reacted to that news by expressing surprise that the Cabinet Manual restricts regular attendance by officials at meetings to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Cabinet. He said, and I quote, "It's time for Jacinda Ardern to broaden her horizons, take advice from multiple sources on an equal basis, and have a democratically elected Cabinet without unelected Klingons." Close quote. Now, remember these people. Carolyn Tremaine, Chief Executive of MB, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, employer of frontline border workers. Then there's the chairperson of the board, Christine Stevenson, also an employer of frontline border workers who were having to have a jab. Ray Smith, Director General of MPI, the Ministry for Primary Industries. Oh, and a boss for people working at the border that needed a jab. And again, here's Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who we now know goes to Cabinet meetings on a regular basis. He can't be of independent thought on this board. So now we're going to take a closer look at this decision-making of the Border Executive Board. But first, have a look at this. The language in this background from the terms of reference for the Border Executive Board, or BEB, is really interesting because it talks about collaboration between these government agencies. It talks about systems, border systems. It talks about passengers and traders. It talks about a smart and safe border, needs to be separated or supported by a dedicated forum with a systems approach to its operations and a mechanism for stronger and more enduring commitments to implement joint initiatives. But what it doesn't mention anywhere is anything to do with operations in terms of staff, and it especially doesn't mention anything about the health and safety of those staff. What it does indicate to me is that there was a culture already existing in this board, and it's that existing culture that should be in the back of our minds when we read the following minutes. The first meeting of the BEB was held on January the 13th, 2021. The first thing that strikes me in these minutes is the second point of the notes labelled Policy Update. That indicates to me that although this is a new board and entity, it's operating with a business as usual approach. There's no reference, other than the chair welcoming members to the first meeting of the BEB, that anything has changed. There's a question raised about whether enough's been done to test MIQ staff and other border workers for the Rona, and also discussion around vaccine planning and communications with border workers. Remember, this is in mid-January, and it's obvious the subject has been discussed before, at least in the December 2020 meeting. The Ministry of Health advises that work was underway to identify individuals who would be offered the opportunity to be jabbed first. And the next bit is interesting. The board discussed the importance of working with the unions and the need for continued testing, because even with the jab, it was possible to act as carriers for the virus. So there's 2 points I'll raise here. The first is talk about working with unions, which is an acknowledgement of employment issues and a potential blurring of boundaries between governance and management. The second, in my opinion, is it was known as far back as January that the supposed vaccine offer didn't stop a person carrying the virus. Okay, so now we go to the meeting of the 4th of February, and I've highlighted the second paragraph not only for its content but the language used. First, the customs boss provides an overview of a collective plan for government agencies to roll out a jab program to border workers and also their household contacts. But the next bit is interesting. Did the board discuss issues and concerns about expecting staff to be jabbed? No. About individual health and safety assessments? Nope. About the New Zealand Bill of Rights that allows a person to refuse a medical treatment? Nope. No, the issues and concerns were about the potential risk to the Rona elimination strategy, which of course was a government policy. The board was concerned about what would happen if staff refused. And guess what? The Ministry of Health said it wasn't a problem because the risk was minimal given the continued use of PPE gear and testing. Then they went on to discuss using well-being and safety, not as a tool to measure risk to staff, but as a useful motivation to encourage and drive jab numbers. It was also agreed to include jab requirements into new contracts, even though they knew unjabbed people presented minimal to no risk. Is there a picture starting to develop in your mind? Because in these minutes from a different meeting, we have reference to Crown Law, who's obviously presenting to the board, and it's noting that a cabinet paper on maximising the uptake of the jab was being reframed to outline options that would, if approved, prohibit frontline workers from remaining in that role unless jabbed. Options for Tier 1 staff who refused vaccination and who could not be redeployed were discussed, including what was feasible under current legislation. The Ministry of Health noted that the outcomes of the frontline vaccination phase would have considerable influence on the public opinion and confidence around the broader rollout of vaccination to the public, and provided a brief overview of the communication strategy it intended to roll out with these government agencies to assure staff and encourage uptake of the jab. By the February 18th meeting, a draft ministerial report outlining the approach not to maximise the health and safety of border workers, but to maximise the uptake of the jab was presented. It was anticipated that gradual peer pressure and the promise of overseas travel would do the trick. But there is a subtle change in strategy. Suddenly there's reference to a window of 8 weeks to allow for a voluntary uptake before considering alternative employment options. Oh, And consulting with unions is raised again, so that risk assessment reviews were needed to be talked about before determining next steps. A week later, and the BEB is reflecting on the success to date of the jab rollout. A paper to Cabinet outlining options to maximise uptake was discussed, with feedback and sign-off expected that weekend. What's rather strange is that MPI was still developing a process for individual risk assessments, which was to be shared with the other agencies as part of its health and safety and employment relations management of the jabs. The board also discusses using jab data to assess whether any additional levers were required to increase uptake. Dear viewer, I put it to you, additional lever is code for mandatory order. Then a discussion follows about the board's actual setup. There's proposed terms of reference and a draft strategic work program some 6 weeks after the board first met. And that could be a problem. Now we fast forward 7 weeks, and now the writing is really on the wall for unjabbed border workers. That additional lever that's been discussed earlier is now provided by the customs boss as an overview of a proposed new order establishing the government's expectation that all high-risk work at the border would be carried out by vaccinated workers. So, did board members display political neutrality? Did they cast a critical eye over the proposal? Did they use independent thinking to question any aspect of it? No. The board agreed to a recommendation that public sector agencies, excluding Maritime New Zealand and Aviation Security, be included in the order. And, of course, dear viewer, that also meant all those health and safety risk assessments and talks with unions were no longer required. So, what's my take on all of this? Well, I believe questions must be asked in what capacity the chief executives were acting in. In my mind, all those workers who either felt coerced into getting the jab for fear of losing their jobs, or were actually those who did lose their jobs, I think, as is their right, that they should feel betrayed by their bosses. To me, it's clear the board was hell-bent on satisfying the will of the government in terms of using border workers to influence the public rollout of the jab. Now, the Employment Relations Act sets out the fundamental obligations both employers and employees have towards each other. So, in my next video, I'll explore the question of whether the BEB operated beyond the scope of its terms of reference and how it ended up in such a mess for affected employees. But as always, I want to thank you very much for clicking on my video and watching. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please do click the like button, share with your family and friends, subscribe if you haven't done, click the bell and you'll be notified of the next video as it goes up. Bye!